Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second seminar in our Historians on Planetary Futures series. I'm Jared Hall, co-director of the New Earth Histories Research Program and postdoctoral fellow at UNSW. And I convene this series with my colleagues, Dr. Stephen Pascoe and Dr. Emma Thomas, both postdoctoral fellows with the Laureate Centre for History and Population. Today, it's my pleasure to present Professor Libby Robin, whose talk is entitled World-mindedness and the Local National Parks for the 1956 Melbourne Olympics. Before I introduce Professor Robin properly, I'd like to begin today's seminar by acknowledging that many of us are tuning in from unceded land. I'd like to acknowledge especially that we're hosting this call from Bedegal land. I'd like to recognise Bedegal elders past and present and extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Libby Robin is Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University. She has worked in universities and museums in Australia, Sweden, the UK, Germany, Denmark, and Estonia, mostly in interdisciplinary environmental studies and the environmental humanities. She's published widely on the history of environmental science, including the book, The Environment, the History of the Idea, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2018, co-authored with Paul Ward and Sverker Sorlin. She now works as an independent scholar and curator at large, researching the role of science, humanities, and the creative arts in museums and climate policy. She was elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities in 2013. Today, it's my pleasure to present Professor Robin's seminar, World-mindedness and the Local National Parks for the 1956 Olympics.
Thank you very much, Jared. That was a nice introduction. I'm speaking from Bunurong land here, which is not my usual home. And I've done a lot of my writing on other unceded lands. And I want to follow up Jared's acknowledgement of elders past, present, and emerging. Now, I have a PowerPoint. Can we all see that? Yep, good. So I'll just straight into it. The Melbourne Olympics made a brave statement to the world in 1956. Australia had become a global player. The Olympics had never travelled to the Southern Hemisphere before. The bid was the first made for nearly a decade. Both the 1940 and 1944 Olympics had been cancelled, and the austerities of war still hung over the relaunch of the Olympics in London in 1948. London and Helsinki had been chosen before the war, London for the cancelled 1944 Games, and Helsinki as a late replacement for Tokyo, when Tokyo in 1938 declared itself unable to host the 1940 Olympics. Helsinki hosted the 52 event and became the most northerly city ever to host a Summer Olympics. So the 1956 Olympics was the first post-war choice. Melbourne, Victoria, and Australia offered the Olympic project fresh fields, far from wartime bombs and their legacies, and further than ever before. The Olympics, for their part, offered Melbourne a rare chance to be part of an important international world, which, since Athens in 1896, had been shared around Europe and the United States. Within Australia, city, state, and national players transcended internal tensions and pulled together to secure the Olympics and to execute them with aplomb. As we muddle through a pandemic where the local and national struggle unevenly with our present global predicament, the Olympics of 1956 remind us of a different time, a time when world-mindedness fueled the zeitgeist. So the greatest challenge to planetary historians is working simultaneously with human, ecological, and geological scales to disentangle their interplay. This small case study doesn't tackle them all, but it does cast significant light on the historical moment of the beginning of the Great Acceleration, how it felt to be a citizen of the Southern Hemisphere in this time of explosive development. Most of the citizens I talk about are white men from rich countries, and they are not good on feelings, as Jamie Dunk explored in the last lecture in this series. Nonetheless, thinking like a planet had its origins in this time. And the Melbourne Olympics is a convenient conceit within which to unpack a global context in a very particular place. It's nice too to think about the geopolitics of big sport as we come away from the Winter Olympics in Beijing 2022, as Chinese diplomacy shapes new geopolitics of peace. Also, they say. So in this talk, I want to explore the way two big international ideas, national parks and the Olympic movement, played out on the ground in the 1940s and 50s Australia. This was a time when reconstruction was a mantra for society, for business and for land use alike. Austerity, organisational logistics borrowed from the military, shaped the lives of ordinary people. Citizens were called upon to adopt efficient methods, to work together for the common cause of rebuilding the nation and the whole world after the crisis of the war. Development was king. Industrial agriculture, mining and urbanisation expanded all over the world at unprecedented pace. The University of Melbourne, the only university in the state until 1961, bulged with war veterans qualifying via fast-track degrees for careers in peacetime services. Often these new graduates came from families who'd never been to university, nor would have expected to have such an opportunity. Some of the new career paths helped heal some of the stresses of war service that paid for them. But mostly, no one talked about the war. The future was ahead. Scientists and economists led global policy making for governments, particularly those with expertise in building large data sets and future modelling. These global leaders drove collective global goals right through the 1950s, even as Cold War geopolitics were changing the rules. The 1950s futurists pressed for an international decade of development for the 1960s. Their future 60s view contrasts rather sharply with the 60s in hindsight. For those born in the 40s and 50s, the baby boomer generation, the 60s are remembered nostalgically as a time of youth culture, of rock music, of flower power, protest and surf. The big generation born of the Reconstruction era had little personal experience of economic limits or austerity. More long-lived than any previous generation, they remain influential in the global world well into the 21st century. The idea of the environment itself changed from the late 1960s in the years leading to the Club of Rome Report Limits to Growth and the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972. The conference focused on the idea that there was only one Earth, using the images from NASA that had revealed this to the world. The environment was no longer limitless wilds. Natural resources for human sustenance were limited, and the ecosystems that supported them needed management and protection. Have you got my my Zoom on top of your are you having trouble reading the PowerPoint? I just wondered about. No, it's okay. It's obscuring mine, but that's fine. So the Stockholm conference focused on the idea there was only one Earth. He used the images from NASA that had revealed this to the world. The environment was no longer limitless wilds, and the key priorities identified at Stockholm are still priorities today: climate change, disasters and conflicts, ecosystem management, environmental governance, harmful substances, by which they meant DDT, and resource efficiency. It's not quite the merger of environment and development, the idea of sustainable development that was advanced at the Rio conference in 1992. But the voices that have given it life have changed too over the last 50 years as the Anthropocene epoch has unfolded. The great acceleration of change was forged in the crucible of the expansionist 50s. The activities of the great acceleration have framed the issues since. So global warming, ocean acidification, megacities, other big drivers of our planetary history. What has changed is we now recognise humanity itself as a geological force on Earth. Some of us grieve about this. Okay, the next section is called Globalization and the Emergence of Environmental Science. The architects of the United Nations, established in 1945, conceived the whole world as a village, a single community. They argued that wars occurred when there was a lack of consciousness in the minds of individuals that they were related to a world community. The United Nations defined itself in terms of a global public of world citizens. Historian Perrin Seltzer, who's speaking later in this series, argues that in their quest for a world community, the United Nations endorsed the secure hand of expert-guided state planning. Post-war cosmopolitan scientists, international civil servants, the experts who served the UN, led these new world citizens with a moral responsibility for more than their own nations. This was a time when experts discovered their global souls, in the words of Pico Iyer, who was writing about this rather later. The allegiance of the 1950s experts was above all to world peace. They stepped away from nationalism and began thinking globally. Soil science and peace were constantly juxtaposed in diplomatic manoeuvres. The FAO's soil map of the world, first published in 1961, was both a diplomatic and scientific endeavour. Soil conservation enabled more food production, but it was also a moral mission for people in so-called third world countries, bringing them into the global fold. Global soil problems brought together a range of different scientific experts, including chemists, physicists, agronomists, and botanists. By 1962, interdisciplinary scientists working together in practical natural resource management started calling themselves environmental scientists. Among environmental scientists, the specialist soil scientist bridged the knowledge gaps between agricultural development and land use management through practical and moral force of soil conservation. Imperial expansion through taking over lands for cropping was a practice older than the Roman Empire. Governing against hunger became the next big moral project for global organisations in the immediate context of post-war famine in a chaotic Europe and Northern Africa torn apart by years of war. Walter Clay Loudmilk, that's really his name, of the United States Soil Conservation Service, in 1939 declared what he called an 11th commandment: "Thou shalt safeguard thy fields from soil erosion." Loudmilk was a controversial figure, enthusiastically supporting Zionist ventures in Palestine. He chaired the UNESCO Arid Lands Program, and its primary concern was desertification, that is, deserts created by human abuse of agricultural lands. The aim was to restore water and nutrients to soil damaged by overuse and the ravages of war, and to repurpose underwater nutrient-poor lands to feed the world. Feed the world, that phrase keeps coming through. Loudmilk's proselytising made big agriculture central to global planning. Soil scientists were its crucial foot soldiers. International soil initiatives centred on food security. Examples include the 1958 UNESCO Food for Peace plan and the 1960 Congress of Soil Science themed "Alleviate Hunger, Promote Peace Through Soil Science." Practical projects demonstrated the value of expert guidance. The impetus for national parks and wildlife conservation came from a different global group, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It was established actually in 1948 as the International Union for the Protection of Nature, IUPN, until 1956. But IUCN began as an initiative of international scientific groups such as the International Ornithological Congress and the International Zoological Congress, both of which had been meeting since the 19th century. So they were mostly biologists. By the 1940s, they were concerned about the practical welfare of wildlife and ecological systems, like the international migratory paths that cross national borders, especially those compromised by warfare and development. The most important funding for IUCN came from the United States, where national parks had gained support from federal politicians. The US was proud of the fact that it supported the world's largest national parks. Harold Jefferson Coolidge became Foundation Vice President of the IUCN and convinced the IUCN board to establish a Provisional Commission on National Parks in 1958, which became a full commission in 1960. Its brief was to establish a UN world list of national parks and protected areas that could bring national parks to the attention of governments worldwide and offer incentives for the creation and maintenance of parks. Coolidge also persuaded the US Congress to fund the first World Congress of National Parks, held in Seattle, USA, in 1962. The European Committee of Experts for the Conservation of Nature and Landscape, note slightly different language, was established the same year, and it was a product of that Seattle conference. Key players in the international politics at this time were UNESCO and its consultative partner IUCN. But the American Congress support for the idea, sorry, there's I thought I lost touch, but it's all right. Key players at the international politics at this time were UNESCO and its consultative partner IUCN, but the American Congress support for the growing national parks movement was crucial. It was America's best idea, as they said, and it was a nationalist tool for global influence. In 1972, at the apogee of the international national parks enthusiasm, the Second World Congress of National Parks was hosted by Yellowstone National Park. 1972 was the centennial year of national parks because it was 100 years since Yellowstone Park was founded. There were other contenders to the claim of first national park in the world, including Royal National Park within a stone's throw of Sydney, which was technically the first legislated national park in the world. Yellowstone's legislation was much later. It took years because the park itself was states, so it had to be federal legislation. The term national park made best sense where the legislation was national to match. Unlike Yosemite, which was also before Yellowstone, and the National Park in Sydney, which were both governed by state legislation. The United States Wilderness Act, passed in the American Congress in 1964, brought together assorted national parks and shaped management and planning, and it shaped IUCN's national parks policy. Conservation leader and forester Aldo Leopold had defined wilderness as a region free of roads and other signs of civilization and big enough to absorb a 2-week pack trip. Although he died in 1949, Aldo Leopold created the language of the 1960s American wilderness movement. World-mindedness itself was based on the idea of a single, united global community, echoing Leopold's moral community that cared for people and wider nature together. Leopold's thinking like a mountain, in a sense, became thinking like a planet. Caring was good for people and good for the intimate places they cared about, and the intimacy of place grew to be inclusive of the scale of a small blue planet by the 1970s. Aldo Leopold's influence reached Australia directly via his ecologist son, Starker, who was an international wildlife consultant for the CSIRO in the 1960s. In terms of the Act, wilderness was an area of land retaining its primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation. Protecting whole ecosystems for wildlife was much more important than the earlier lungs for the city model from industrial Britain that underpinned the 19th century national park legislation in New South Wales. Australia was proud to support the centennial inlet because it represented vast acreages rather than just small reserves on the edge of big cities. National parks in Australia were becoming more ecologically based and internationally minded as early as the Queen's visit in 1953. Declaring the National Park Royal that year was one example. The new, bigger national park sentiment was important when the international, national, state and city forces came together to create the friendly Olympics in Melbourne. We'll now turn to the Olympic bid. By the 1940s, Melbourne was no longer the parliamentary capital of Australia. Canberra had been established in 1927, and the diplomatic missions based there, there weren't many, but Canberra itself was still a small city with few industries apart from government. Most of the public service had immigration, the post office, the departments of Army and Navy, manufacturing all remained in Melbourne until the 1960s and beyond. Melbourne remained industrial capital of Australia. Manufacturing industries developed in post-war years needed port facilities and labour, so immigrants from overseas and interstate flooded to Victoria, not Canberra. The new industries also drove the work of the Commonwealth Department of Post-War Reconstruction, which elected to stay on in Melbourne despite various efforts to move it to Canberra both during the war, when it was called War and Industry, and in the late 1940s. The Department of Post-War Reconstruction controlled many of the committee collaborative structures that enabled the state and federal levels of government to manage the emergency situation of the war together, particularly in agriculture, forestry, and natural resource management, which were traditionally state responsibilities. Although the idea of the environment was only in its infancy, the sciences that brought it together worked across local, state, national, and international scales. Australia had hosted the last Empire Games before the war in Sydney in 1938, and boxing enthusiast, sports administrator, and from 1955 Conservative politician, Sir Edgar Tanner, saw the Olympics as an opportunity to showcase Melbourne. He convened a meeting of the Victorian Olympic Committee in June 1946, which resolved to apply for the Games. Tanner was appointed Secretary-Treasurer to the Australian Olympic Committee, the Australian Olympic Federation in 1947, and working with the VOC chairman, Bill Uren, and Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Councillor Raymond Connolly, and Sir Frank Beaurepaire, a three-time Olympian. He was also a business leader and state politician. Tanner and the VOC submitted the Melbourne bid to the IOC in Switzerland early in 1948. Edgar Tanner was the Australian Olympic team manager, used his presence at the London Olympics to press Melbourne's case. He saw at first hand how difficult the organisation of the Olympics was in times of post-war austerity. He had to thumb lifts to the stadiums for his team members in lorries, wagons and private cars. One group of Australian athletes famously arrived at Wembley Stadium in a garbage truck. The Melbourne bid was officially endorsed at a meeting of the IOC in Rome in 1949. Tanner became Secretary of the Melbourne Olympics Games Organising Committee at that point. So all the bidding happened in the 40s, but the Games were 1956. It's really 40s thinking we're talking about here, and how it was used in the 50s. By 1950s, Melbourne was prosperous and showing off its prosperity in all things new. Melbourne was a city with a future gaze towards the 1960s decade of development. This was a suitable background for the friendly Olympics that the movement craved. Borrowing style patterns from the two Nordic Olympics of 1952, first Oslo in winter, then Helsinki in summer, Melbourne presented itself as a new city with a modern culture in a new hemisphere for a peaceful Olympic movement and many international visitors. The international Olympic visitors demanded culture, but they also wanted a wider sort of tourism. Many of the athletes and their supporters travelled for a month on a ship each way to Australia. At the time, planes were prohibitively expensive and took complex routes. For most internationals, this was their first venture south of the equator. They wanted to see Australia, not just their favourite sports in action. So that's the culture. That's Arthur Boyd's statue outside the Olympic swimming stadium. Tourism offices before the war had been the province of the Victorian Railways. In the 1930s, a holiday trip, whether for a day or a week, was dependent on taking a train, then walking or cycling, as few people had cars. Bushwalking was cheap and popular. It fostered an interest in fitness, in nature study, both deemed improving to boys and young men. And in the Depression years, bushwalking was low cost, and people spent very little money beyond their rail ticket. In the post-war years, as Melbourne suburbs spread into the green fields between the suburban railway networks, ordinary working families acquired a car. Melbourne's Tourist Bureau developed a whole new raft of day trips and excursions, as tourism, including nature tourism, became the basis for small business. Tourists travelled beyond railway lines, taking their whole families, sometimes for picnics, camping and caravanning. Landscapes further afield and remote fishing and swimming spots became popular. The new tourists needed a road and a place to leave the car. The other amenities supplied at their destinations, such as motels, petrol stations and roadside cafes. The signature businesses that serviced 1950s family holidays. The international tourist, with plenty of money at the time, had an additional dimension to tourism. International tourists had a particular interest in the distinctive Australian landscapes and animals that were so different from their home countries. The citizens of Melbourne had spent the 40s steadily assembling enough materials to build homes to accommodate the new families of the baby boom years. Shortages of nails and building materials limited house sizes, but with the help of architects like Robin Boyd, a small home could be self-built, truly elegant, and replete with modern conveniences for the new family unit, the nuclear family. Most families acquired their first car in this period. Wartime sacrifices became post-war efficiency. An independent can-do attitude was encouraged. Sorry, that's the language that slipped in. That came from the 1950s, not from Scott Morrison. War veterans and their families moved into rapidly expanding new suburbs. Some went farming in land settlement schemes in country areas like the Wimmera and Mallee. But in the flurry of new development, Australia fell behind the rest of the world in reserving land for national parks and wildlife conservation. A variety of international ideas about whole landscape management were gathering pace in the 1940s, and local campaigners drew on their authority to shore up support for nature reserves and where they exist in national parks. In Victoria, the popular Argus journalist and national radio broadcaster Crosby Morrison launched a local post-war New Deal for the wild things in 1946. Morrison's secret wartime work had included inspecting Wilson's Promontory, the most popular national park in the state, which had been exploited and seriously damaged in military practice manoeuvres. There was no funding or staff to repair the damage. The park was run by a local ranger who did mostly fire management. Its board comprised a small committee of volunteers. The American language of the New Deal was indicative of how influential American ideas were in Australia at this time. This was a bid to change the way Australians managed national parks, to put their management on a professional and an ecologically informed footing. Morrison was a biologist first, but also an experienced journalist and excellent photographer. His magazine and radio show were major projects of media proprietor Keith Murdoch, Rupert's father, who took a personal interest in them. Morrison's radio broadcasts, Nature Notes, were initially just a promotion for his magazine Wildlife. They spoke to the curiosity of children and their families, and the families sent in nature questions for him to answer in an era before talkback radio. The broadcasts quickly outstripped the magazine in popularity, at times attracting 75% of listeners at 6 p.m. on Sunday evening. Before television, this is what everybody's doing. They quickly became a permanent fixture, telling good stories from modern science, including conservation science. Like the magazine, they were reflective too, often encompassing ideas about the healing power of natural places, sometimes something welcomed by families dealing with wartime trauma. Morrison's media platforms introduced a new generation to the culture of caring for nature, inspiring political action to protect animals. He carefully avoided partisan politics, instead using an old-fashioned conservative style to develop the argument that caring for wild creatures was just part of what made Australia a morally decent place. His notions of justice included the birds and the beasts, as well as the humans. Crosby Morrison's broadcasts launched a decade of what his biographer, Graham Pizzey, called the Great National Parks Campaign. The campaign was strongly focused on Victoria, but drew on national and international comparisons and support. The Victorian National Parks Association, established in 1952, used the motto, "For all people, for all time," which was the title of many of Morrison's public lectures. He travelled around the suburbs of Melbourne and regional Victoria, tirelessly promoting his wildlife magazine and pressing the importance of better management of national parks to field naturalist clubs, JCs, Rotary groups, and other local audiences, with engaging talks illustrated with lantern slides and his own films. Morrison was not alone in his campaign. Antarctic explorer John Bechervaise wrote a prominent centrefold article in the national magazine Walkabout in 1950, entitled, "How Shall We Reckon Their Value?" In the article, he pressed for Wildlife Preservation Society of Australia, which had been established in Sydney by David Stead in 1909, as a Commonwealth Advisory Commission to coordinate the disparate interests of the states. National parks, like public lands generally, Bechervaise argued, must be a function of the state government, There is, however, a nationwide interest also, and although this could scarcely be legislative under the Commonwealth Constitution, it should be marshalled in an Australian League of Preservation with its membership in a common ideal. The Americans called them national parks because they were a federal responsibility. The Australian Constitution would not fit this model. But the international imperative to reserve land for nature demanded coordination between the states and Commonwealth. Late in the 50s, when requests for information about national parks and reserves were coming from international organisations like the IUCN, the Australian Academy of Science, a national body of scientists established in 1954, organised a national overview of the assorted national parks and nature reserves under state management. In the early 1950s, nature lovers felt the pressure of state and private enthusiasm for agricultural development and resource exploitation. Roads were expanding rapidly, absorbing verges and roadside reserves. Small areas of unallocated public land that birdwatchers and orchid specialists knew about were increasingly encroached upon. From the small local boards of management to the Country Roads Board and major government authorities concerned with land management, everyone had an interest in public lands, but there was never time or money to manage them. Particularly in Victoria, which led post-war reconstruction and where there were only two legislative national parks at the time, that's Wilson's Prom and Wyperfeld, the idea that national parks were a legitimate land use was hard to sell. Most other states already had more land allocated to national parks, protecting those areas at least to some extent from resource extraction. But the Victorian Lands Department and the Forests Commission were powerful influences on state thinking and were defensive of their fiefdoms. The New Deal National Parks campaign was losing momentum by the time the Olympics bid was approved in 1949. Cold War politics and the loss of faith in the government further eroded the case for national parks in the 1950s. After a decade of lobbying for proper management of national parks by Crosby Morrison and the amateur field naturalists in the Victorian National Parks Association, the campaign was stagnating. Morrison's own base in the media had been very much weakened by the sudden death of Keith Murdoch in 1952 and his replacement by his ruthless son Rupert, who had none of the love of nature that both his parents were renowned for. A breakthrough came in 1955 when Dewar Good, Secretary of the Australian Primary Producers Union, joined Morrison's voice for birds and beasts. The Australian Primary Producers Union was formed in 1944 with divisions in each state. It was deeply concerned with soil conservation. It eventually unified with the National Farmers Union of Australia, forming the Australian Farmers Federation in 1969. Good was chair of both the state and federal land use committees at a time when the APPU was well funded enough to have his copious correspondence supported by an office. The early 50s was a time when Australians famously lived off the sheep's back, as the Korean War dramatically inflated wool prices, making the APPU one of the nation's most prominent political groups. The Olympics and the new alliance with Dewar Good and the other Commonwealth interests created fresh interest for national parks because they brought in causes closer to the heart of Victoria Premier Henry Bolte, who generally advocated rural development at all costs. A formal meeting, co-convened by Victorian National Parks Association and the Australian Primary Producers Union, brought together the many players concerned with Victoria's national parks management, none of whom had the funding for bringing them up to standard needed for the Olympics. Good particularly seized the opportunity that the Olympic movement offered to engage different players in national parks to make governments combine their efforts more effectively. Good and Morrison, with a number of other conservative Victorians, including Cyril Isaac, of whom more later, wanted the parks organised and accessible in time for the influx of international visitors. But this was just a stepping stone. Their real aim was a proper National Parks Authority for Victoria, based on international best practice in public land use planning. The APPU, the Department of National Development, and the Tourist Resources Committee associated with the Olympic planning were the Commonwealth players at the 1955 meeting, and they resolved to make it authoritative, informed and strong representation and federal governments for adequate funds. So they're trying to do things in as many ways as possible to make the Olympic Games work. The National Parks Authority in Victoria, when it was finally established in 1957, was the first such government authority in Australia. The Olympics had added both the urgency and the national impetus to a campaign that might otherwise have stagnated or dragged on for another decade or more. Morrison became the first director of the small National Parks Authority, and its two members were Stuart Good of the APPU and Cyril Isaac, a retired Conservative politician, who had since the 1940s spearheaded the Natural Resources Conservation League. So I'm now going to go back down to the sort of the fine detail of this, and looking at post-war reconstruction, soil conservation, and building a case for land management. Stuart Good was a credible and experienced practical pastoralist, an enthusiastic soil conservationist, and had excellent networks from his government service in the 1940s, as well as amongst conservative politicians. In a time when conservatism is equated with small government and outsourcing to consultancies, it's hard to remember that during the war years, Conservatives were deeply committed to centralised governance and led big government public service organisation. Declared unfit for active service, Good had found war work in the Commonwealth Department of War Organisation and Industry. So this is the sort of place where he learned his craft. Good's role included the communication of agricultural science methods and research within war planning. James Prescott, agricultural chemist and director of the Waite Institute in Adelaide, knew of his journalism and recommended him for the job. Prescott and Good regularly exchanged correspondence, much of which he passed on to his boss, Senior Rural Advisor to the Commonwealth Department of War Organisation and Industry, that's Jack Crawford. From his early 20s, Good had been responsible for managing pastoral stations in the arid lands north of Goyder's Line in South Australia. He was working there in the difficult 1930s when the topsoil blew away to cities in the east. He was a good communicator of scientific ideas and a keen writer, published widely in farming journals and magazines from the 1930s until he was well into his 80s, dying aged 95 in 2002. He was not a scientist, but he believed in science and learning for the war effort. So this is the Organisation of War Industry and Industry. I put that up a bit earlier, and this is the science and learning in the war. Good's work in war industry led him to the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, but he found himself in an unexciting corner of that department, managing the logistics of importing agricultural machinery and materials. While the so-called food front had been very important during the war and immediately after it, Good found requisitioning materials rather distant from the heroics of food as a munitions requisite. He'd become distanced from his old boss, Jack Crawford, whose illustrious post-war career included briefing Prime Minister Chifley on post-war soldier settlement schemes, establishing the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Economics, which we know as ABARE, and representing Australia at the inaugural meeting of the Food and Agriculture Organisation in Canada in October 1945. So Crawford was a real global player. Despite their divergent paths, Good and Crawford continued to correspond, particularly on matters of soil conservation. Crawford's stellar global trajectory undoubtedly influenced Good's next moves. In 1946, Good despaired of changing the world through the Public Service Department of Post-War Reconstruction. He returned to the land. He bought a property, Brim near Hamilton in Western Victoria, where he experimented with practical conservation restoration and tree planting. Brim allowed him to implement many of the international ideas he'd read about or learned from his correspondence. He also established the Hamilton Field Naturalist Club in 1958 and was its president for many years. He became a passionate supporter of managing land for wildlife as well as production. As a member of the Melbourne Club and an organiser for Liberal Party campaigns in Western Victoria at both state and federal government level, Good had contacts at all levels. He used them all for his environment work. His politics was very, very different from the leftist politics of Ross Garnet, the long-serving secretary of the Victorian National Parks Association, who was mistrusted by Conservative leaders because he'd been secretary of the Australian Association of Scientific Workers in the 1940s, where many communists had been influential. Garnet was not a communist, but throughout the 1950s, he was conscious that ASIO spooks followed him everywhere, including to many naturalist clubs of which he was a member. They would sit up the back in the gloom. They found no Cold War politics, he commented, but they learnt much about national parks, orchids and birds. Despite their political differences, or maybe even because of them, Good, Garnet and Morrison worked well together, bonding through their common passion for natural history and conservation. Good's country networks complemented Morrison's largely suburban national parks campaign. People interested in primary production knew about conservation too, but farmers and the APPU had more interest in restoring damaged lands, managing water better, and improving production outcomes than in bushwalking. Good worked actively to integrate soil conservation into wildlife management to bridge the country-city divide. In his 1950s campaign, Good drew on eclectic sources to criticise the dominant natural resource practices of state government departments that have nothing to be proud of in public land management and conservation. That's a quote from him. He typed notes to himself, which in these notes reveal the lines of his arguments in talks and newspaper columns and other publications. This is an example. Soil and wildlife conservation both depend fundamentally on the re-establishment and maintenance of vegetation. Each, therefore, may not only make important contributions to the other, but is actually essential to the other's highest expression. Without soil conservation, climax vegetation with its associated animal life must largely disappear. Without wildlife conservation, vegetation is of important protection, and ultimately the soil itself must lose the benefit of a powerful factor in its upbringing, the direct influence of animal life. Borrowing from the United States, Good invoked Aldo Leopold's game management philosophies and arguments, widely used by economic ornithologists in the early 20th century, including prominent Washington ornithologist and soil conservationist Ernest G. Holt. Good went on to argue, wildlife requires unburned, ungrazed woodland of mixed species of age classes with abundant undergrowth. Such a woodland protects against soil erosion and offers excellent habitats for wildlife. Trees of an even age, such as clumps of pine or eucalyptus, do not attract wildlife. Good assembled a powerful case against industrial forestry and the widespread clearing for monocultural agriculture which he observed all over Western Victoria. He regularly reported his observations to Cyril Isaac, director of the Natural Resources Conservation League, and published in its magazine, Conservation News. City wildlife enthusiasts tended to focus on animals, especially birds, but vegetation and land management enthused farmer conservationists. Habitat management made good sense to regional enthusiasts interested in finding birds in their own districts. Wood's arguments anticipate by decades the 21st century wisdom of the call of the reed warbler, the work of another practical farmer conservationist, Charles Massey. I don't know if any of you saw Four Corners last night, but Charles was speaking there. Both Massey and Good brought practice into the mainstream of production land management, rescuing it from obscurity and amateurism. They refused to separate production from conservation. Such connection greatly enhances the case of conservation in any era. Good argued publicly at the APPU conference in 1954 that the coordination of conservation should be a federal responsibility and passed a motion recommending this. He privately, however, recognised that it was unlikely, and he began to campaign quietly to ensure that the state governments that ended up managing national parks were sympathetic to conservation and knew something about international trends. Economic uncertainties and changing markets were driving bigger and more consolidated enterprises that did not support rural developments. Something that worried the APPU. They wanted to keep country schools and businesses going. And the politicians representing those areas, including Victorian Premier Henry Bolte, wanted that too. They might not have any interest in wildlife, but they knew about their electorate. Olympics tourism was good for developers. National parks created tourism, and tourists needed businesses in rural areas. So this was a win-win-win. As an enthusiastic supporter of the Independent Natural Resources Conservation League, Good wrote regularly to Cyril Isaac, a member of Victoria's Legislative Council, Upper House, who understood both the state's political and bureaucratic systems. Isaac was a nurseryman and a teacher before going into politics. It's the sort of skills we don't see very often in politics today. He brought these interests and skills to the NRCL. The NRCL's nursery still raises tree seedlings to revegetate Victorian roadsides. This was started as a practical post-war campaign to restore landscapes eroded by road making and neglect, and to provide cover for birds amidst vast private agricultural acreages. The NRCL and its predecessor, the Save the Forests campaign, worked closely with the Forest Commission, the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission, and the Soil Conservation Authority, and also with many municipal councils in this endeavour. In a letter to Isaac early in 1955, Good observed that the small Soil Conservation Authority and the Departments of Fisheries and Game were the only state departments who showed themselves capable of protecting vegetation and wildlife. Perhaps because they were small and worked with modest budgets, they were able to avoid some of the infighting big egos and lobbyists that characterise the major departments of land management, that's lands, agriculture and forests. In the letter to Isaac, Good even proposed tentatively that the key staff at the Soil Conservation and Fisheries and Game could become members of the proposed National Parks Authority with Crosby Morrison as director. The triumvirate leadership worked well in the Soil Conservation Authority and was the model he was suggesting. This leadership model was indeed adopted 2 years later, and the director for the National Parks Authority was Crosby Morrison. However, as we've already seen, they went outside the public service and appointed Isaac and Good themselves to the task of being members. So the National Parks Authority was thereby sort of separated somewhat from the rules of the public service, which is an interesting problem for it later. A multifaceted new understanding of the natural world emerged in the 1950s and 60s, enabling disparate departments of the state to work together. The Land Utilisation Advisory Committee was a practical collective force for land management planning in the 50s and 60s. It was chaired by the chairman of the Soil Conservation Authority, initially George Thompson and later Jeff Downs. The LUAC joined together the organisations responsible for land management and conservation, forestry, agriculture, water management and waste disposal. It still wasn't quite the environment as the general public understood it from the 1970s, but the conservation tradition that emerged out of natural resource management, wise use philosophies and natural history laid the grounds for later reassembling and for collaboration across different sorts of expertise. The best example of this was the pioneering Land Council in 1971, established as a direct result of the Fiery Little Desert campaign in 68 and 69. The campaigners worked together via the Save Our Bushlands Action Committee, which included both NRCL and the VNPA, and the LCC was more broadly based than its predecessor. It was a quango with an independent non-public service chair, Sam Dimmick. It also had representatives from major conservation activist organisations, including the Conservation Council of Victoria. The LCC was tasked with reviewing the actual and ideal best possible land use for every region of the state. It moved cautiously. Little Desert National Park was the last region of state surveyed and was declared in 1988, 20 years after the heated campaign, which was regarded as a watershed in conservation and land management planning. From the 1950s, national parks and conservation became a viable economic land use as well as habitat for wildlife. Once recreation was an economic activity, not just a matter for the amateur enthusiasms of bushwalkers and bird watchers, it became part of the suite of land uses considered by the LUAC and even more by the LCC. Land use management demands a fusion of local concerns, including what we now call NIMBY concerns, with the regional, national and international needs. The institutions of state and Commonwealth governments fit uneasily into this multi-scaled management problem, and generally interests are more nimble. So most management is retrospective and negative. Declaring national parks has been one positive, proactive initiative of state government bureaucracies. But as public services have downsized steadily since the last decades of the 20th century, there's been a struggle has struggled to maintain public lands, and also the sorts of support public and land managers offer private landholders. Landcare, an initiative of Bob Edgar of the Victorian Department of Agriculture in 1982, emphasised landholder ownership of eroded and damaged lands, not simply turning to governments to fix them. Soil management has downscaled since then into private hands and local catchment management authorities. Soil conservation has faded from state government institutional titles, usually replaced by environment. There were no longer resources for regulating public lands as national parks or locking up lands, as the critics still call it. The Land Conservation Council lost its regulatory teeth and was replaced by a diluted Environment Conservation Council, now further diminished and called Environment Victoria. Volunteerism rather than public service has again become the modus operandi in the conservation sector, as it was before the war. There's been a new turn to buying back the bush via conservation covenants on private land and purchased by philanthropically funded conservation groups. Trust for Nature Victoria was the first Australian example of these groups, established exactly 50 years ago in 1972. Drawing on American ideas from such organisations as the Nature Conservancy, TFN bought up land with remnant conservation values, usually in Western Victoria, then added a legal conservation covenant, which made clearing the remaining vegetation illegal, and then sold the property again to keep the funding like a rolling fund. This became particularly important in the 1980s as government support for conservation shrank, and it turned out it was unexpectedly profitable. TFN raised money to cover the losses on covenanted land as opposed to uncovenanted, and it turned out that the people buying the properties loved the vegetation and paid more for covenanted land than for uncovenanted. This was such a surprise for organisers such as Bill Middleton, who was the Western District Forester, who'd been a major leader in the Desert Campaign and the Save Our Bushlands Action Committee. Trust for Nature is now a national organisation, joining Australian Bush Heritage and the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and the Wilderness Society in having conservation properties all over the country. In the 1990s, Indigenous land management, caring for country, became a major new direction, sometimes in partnership with existing national reserves and increasingly through extensive Indigenous protected areas, particularly in the Northern Territory. These have been revolutionary changes in conservation practices, but they are largely homegrown trends, borrowed from global trend centres. The world-minded global souls of the 1950s are now planetary thinkers. Their conservation efforts focus on planetary health, living with the changes brought by the Anthropocene. There are no so-called pristine places to defend anymore. So I've just turning to my conclusions now. So this is a lecture in a series about histories of planetary thinking. Yet mostly I've been talking about world-mindedness and the public good in a world where international ideas serve peacemaking. The Melbourne Olympics provided an opportunity for conservative forces to lead a conservation movement that looked very different from later international environmental activism. This local historical story suggests some pointers for environmental and climate activism in the 21st century. It's a story less polarised, more inclusive, more effective than the sorts of radical green politics we know today. Indeed, tree planting is still often used for soft diplomacy by conservatives. In my final remarks, I want to explore the difference between the global souls of the United Nations era and the planetary warriors of the 21st century. While the era of globalization focused with confidence on economics and peace, planetary thinkers are concerned with a safe operating space for humanity's long-term future, in the words of Johan Rockström and his colleagues, a subject J.B. Dunk touched on in the last lecture in the series. Dunk reminded us of the continuing wicked problem of achieving so-called sustainable development and justice, and how just grappling with planetary health is emotionally exhausting and can be paralysing. Personal health can suffer in the search for the planetary. There's a fundamental paradox here. A safe operating space demands an incredibly high level of sophisticated scientific understanding and modelling the ways of air, water, and ocean they work together. Yet in the 21st century, scientists are no longer considered preeminent experts in the public good as they were at a time when world-mindedness and feeding the world were at the forefront of global efforts. Indeed, within a very short time of proposing a safe operating space, Rockstrom's Nature paper was complemented by a different version. The Oxfam economist Kate Raworth turned the focus to internal justice for humanity, what she called the inside of the donut. Beyond the overreach of the Rockstrom pie chart, she focused on the moral responsibilities of humans alive today, particularly those who have already disproportionately benefited from the riches of the Anthropocene, the white men in wealthy countries who led that earlier world-mindedness. Natural resource management created rare diplomatic networks and geopolitical connections in times when travel was rare. Soil scientists in Soviet Russia, for example, worked closely with American soil conservation initiatives despite wide political differences. Dust bowls haunted both places, and other considerations were set aside to find a solution to practical problems framed in scientific and rational terms. Academies of science worked internationally, sidestepping all sorts of awkward national political differences. Scientific liaison offices established during the war continued long after, nurturing international connections, at least within the English-speaking world, at a time when international meetings were small, expensive, and time-consuming. The Swedish Academy of Science perhaps had a disproportionate influence on global thinking of its heroes through the awarding of Nobel Prizes. It inspired other learned academies also to use their influence to shape national and international public opinion, including the Australian Academy of Science. The Swedes still do a lot of global leadership. Johan Rockstrom is from this sort of lineage. Scientists were the ones with the future in their bones, novelists and physicists C.P. Snow, 1959, Reed Lecture. But the sciences of natural resource management, which are not generally based in Cambridge labs, nations collaborated with each other on diverse natural resource management projects, but none of them on the scale of the whole planet. Multifaceted problems like soil erosion and desertification were chosen by UNESCO for their special arid lands program, partly because they held the promise of a scientific solution, but mostly because there were geopolitical reasons for the choices. The Arid Zone program was initiated by and for the new nations of the 1940s, India and Israel, and later created opportunities for other nations like Australia and Peru that had arid lands with desertification problems. UNESCO built partnerships using national scientific bodies like CSIRO. Within Australia, international interests justified building collaborations between CSIRO and state ag departments. Even major initiatives like the International Geophysical Year of 1957-8 and UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere project, launched in 1971, tended to follow the patterns of national institutions of science rather than of the physical workings of the planet. Indeed, what was possible via MA was limited to the details of ecological organisation in Australia, as the Australian Academy of Science report documented in 1975. However, world-making were the efforts of science in the 20th century. They did not become distinctively planetary until the 21st. The idea of world-making, coined in 1978 by philosopher Nelson Goodman, argued that scientific ways of knowing were not the only ones. Goodman and other philosophers promoted the value of the skills of the arts and the notion of diverse worlds. This is not to say that scientific ways of knowing were not valuable, but rather that society depends on more than scientific data for its decision-making. Indeed, the idea that natural science was different from and rather more important than other ways of knowing the world was much more accentuated in the English-speaking world, where science had become natural science. Even in other Germanic languages, science still includes philosophy and the arts, as it had in the Latin scientia. Snow's Two Cultures division in 1959 was a peculiarly Oxbridge insight of its times. Since the 1950s, there's been a growing sense that the West does not have a superior handle on knowledge anyway, nor does it have sole rights to decide which data to collect. Where the 1940s world-mindedness was about shaping a single world united against conflict, there are now many ways of being in the world and world-making. World-making includes not just linguistic, cultural and disciplinary diversity, but increasingly the world-making of more than human others, as promoted by biologist philosopher Donna Haraway. And world-making itself can create novel meaning, as, for example, physicist, philosopher Karen Berard proposes in the concept of agential realism. The world and how we know it is now a kaleidoscope of options at many scales. The whole world, in the old sense, is much smaller than the sum of its parts, as philosopher Timothy Morton argues cogently. Indeed, bigger and smaller themselves are the function of the scale at which we work, as it was argued in 1967 by Mandelbrot using his coastal paradox. Yet we still have only one planet. The diverse environmental consciousness of the 1972 conference, the local, the international and the global, huddled into a single book, Only One Earth, pulled together by natural scientists Barbara Ward and Renee DeBose. NASA's famous Earth rising image from space gave it a new fine shape. Singular images of the blue planet echo on into the 21st century, but the context is different. The planetary, in some sense, remains a task for science, yet science itself no longer has the preeminence for policymakers that it had at the time of the acceleration. History can help show how the planetary diverged from the global and from the world-mindedness of the 1950s. Perhaps this lateral contribution may in itself enable some planetary voices to enter the world-making era, arena, and there find a way to save the planet from the excesses of its plague species. Environmental historian Graham Wynne reflected recently in the South African Journal of History on the place of historians in the Anthropocene. He recalled Alice in Wonderland's question to the Cheshire Cat. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? The cat's answer, of course, was, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. Wynne looks to Olympic scholars for his response, arguing that if societies share with scholars the challenge of moving forward while looking backward, they must rely upon waypoints and markers behind them to get where they wish to be. Now, as always, historians have a role to play in the selection of those important beacons. Spending time deep in the archives of another era, the era of world-making, has suggested some interesting possibility for the answers to the cat's question of where we want to get to. Historians also need greater awareness, informed by planetary thinking, about how geological changes are already disrupting our societies and their moral purpose, and how these world-breaking changes are changing history itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Libby. I'd like to invite everyone to give a Zoom round of applause for that seminar. Thank you very much. Claps for me. So we have about 30 minutes or so for questions. I think we'll run this either by using the Zoom function to raise your hand and I'll come through to you, I'll throw to you, or, alternatively, you can write out a message in the chat. We already have one question, which is good. I might read that out. So this one's from Anthony. An interesting window into the way the landscape was being viewed and marked at the time of the Melbourne Olympics is that the main theme of the road names of the athletes' village in Heidelberg West appears to be World War II battles and some military infrastructure. I've never found any discussion on how that implied diplomacy might have gone over with some athletes over only 11 years after the war ended. Libby, do you have any insights on this? Thank you for a great seminar.
That's a great question. My mother lived near the Heidelberg West village in a suburb called McLeod, and she lived in Jacker Street, which was part of what was called the VC's estate. So I think that whole area was opened up at that time with so this is not my research, it's just what I happen to know. But I think that they used post-war reconstruction was a way to get budgets. If you wanted to get something done, you said you were doing it to honour war veterans. It was a very consistent way of managing public monies to get what you needed. I think they probably started planning. Well, I know they probably started planning the Olympic Village as early as 1949, possibly as early as 1946, and certainly the people in that period were calling everything after the war. So one of the things is the long time between when you bid and when you get your Olympics. Keep thinking it's 1956. It's actually 1946, a lot of the thinking. So I think that's the answer to the question. Sandro is another West Heidelberg local here. My mother did, never lived in the place my mother lived in West Heidelberg, but it's nice to, hi Sandro.
Stephen?
Hi, Libby. Thank you so much for a really, really fascinating paper. I particularly found your comments on the fact that the conservationist movement was largely driven by conservatives in this period to be really fascinating. But that's not the question that I want to ask you. I haven't yet formulated a question around that. But the question that I wanted to ask you was to do with how the idea of world-mindedness, which you've suggested is this idea of a single world united against peace, how that might have played out in Melbourne at the time, given both a few of the international kind of contexts of that time. You know, you had the Suez Crisis playing out precisely when the Olympics was going on, and then a few months prior there had been the uprising in Hungary, which was brutally repressed by the Soviets, and there's the famous blood in the water story at the Melbourne Olympics in the polo game between Hungary and Soviet Union. I'm wondering, have you noticed in your readings of the press of this period any discussion of this kind of fractious geopolitics coming up against the ideals of a world united against peace?
Yeah, I think the peacemaking was pretty much finished by the end of the 40s, and by the 50s we're into Cold War in no uncertain terms, and so the fights are all about oil. I don't think there's anything very unusual in that, but I'm glad you picked up on the conservation of conservatives, because that's what I'm trying to write a book about at the moment. I think that the far right dominance of the discourse of the conservatives is very uncomfortable for most old-fashioned conservatives these days. And you only have to follow John Hewson's column in the Saturday paper to see how very far so-called conservative has become. It's not conservative at all. It's quite radical, and it's the radical right. So I think conservation and conservative obviously have the same linguistic root and the same, and the sort of the idea of conservation or being conservative as a common ground that people who have different political views can share is probably the best possible future for the non-human elements of our planet. So that's I would like to write a book that moves us back and doesn't make. I think the invention of the idea of green as left wing was a spin effort by the right, in fact, to polarize a movement that wasn't polarized at all at that time. So in terms of the Hungarian uprising was very relevant. The whole Hungarian water polo team defected, so they all became Australians, and that part of the great happy post-war immigration story of Australia. I think there were other cases too, but it was such a long trip. I mean, if you read the documents of academics, for example, traveling in the 1950s to England, they had to, if they had work to do in England, they had to go for a year, because it took them a month to get there and a month to get back. I actually travelled with my father to England when I was 2. It was just at the very end of the 50s, and Dad was a student, had a scholarship for a student to be a student in England, and he was also a clergyman, so he could be a clergyman on a boat and get paid for that. His wife was free, and I think I was free too, because I was so young. So it was a way to get all the furniture and us there for almost no money, which was, it was all about no money. So I know it took a month, and I was seasick the whole way, and we came back 2 years later, and I was seasick all the way back. So that's all I remember of the trip. But I do, the consciousness that period of and you read it in a lot of people's memories. They have a whole month on the ship with a random selection of interesting international people, and they meet people that they wouldn't otherwise meet. People like Jack Crawford would have travelled on a boat probably to the FAO meeting in 1945, and they wouldn't have had a month off work now with no email to bother them. I mean, it's just incredible. They got a chance to reflect and to sort of reassemble their worlds in a much more international way. I mean, it was obviously they were reassembling them with rich people and not with diverse voices. Let's not pretend, but it was. I think it was a very different. The pace of life has changed so much that then that's what's part of our problems now.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks, Libby. There's a comment here from Kazia Jazaska. I think Expo 1958 in Brussels can be considered alongside the Melbourne Olympics as another spectacular attempt toward the global narrative of peace and collaboration. Do you have any thoughts on that, Libby? Kind of linkages between...
It's a very... I'm trying to remember what they've got a special name for the park where it was, in case you might know it. But anyway, I've been there, and it is very sort of, and it sets up Brussels for being the head of the EU. I mean, it's quite, because the European Union needed that sense of focus, and of course the European Union began with Brussels, France, Germany, and Liechtenstein, I think it was, who had a coal agreement, and so they set up a situation where you got your coal from one place. You got your iron from another place, and you couldn't make military hardware without having both France and Germany involved, that's the beginning of the EU. So there is that sort of, and I'm sure the Expo 58 there's the park there is still there, and you can go out on a tram, and it's an amazing place to go. It's very, but it's much more now about Europe, but they use the park for. Because the world-mindedness really has become European-mindedness. The European community is the last ditch of that, I think, in lots of ways. Though the African community may be similar. Did you have any further comments on that, Keisha? You might know more about it than I do.
Thanks for the talk. No, it's just kind of a thought, because this is my area of expertise, and I know that these big spectacular events in terms of sports event, but also events like expos and world exhibitions, they have been often considered together as this kind of very similar attempts towards diplomacy, cultural diplomacy or sports diplomacy. So I think there are certain parallels, and for me the fact that Olympics are being organized or expos are being organized in certain places, that automatically will exclude or include certain nations. So then the visions of the collaboration, the vision of the diplomacy or the aims of the diplomacy that each country plans to present would obviously shift. So this is something that I find personally interesting. But
it's a very good point too, that the expos were in the Southern Hemisphere long before the Olympics. So the Melbourne exhibition buildings, it was in fact the first building on the World Heritage List, because it's the last standing expo building of the 19th century anywhere in the world that hadn't burnt down. All the others, because they're built out of wood, they'd all burnt down, and Melbourne perhaps had enough rain to stop that happening. But anyway, it's certainly different. Thanks for that.
Alison?
Hi, Libby, and hi, everybody. Great to see you, and great, as always, to hear your capacity to scale in and out, Libby, is unsurpassed. And we've all known that for a long time, and here we have it again. But if I can go to the big scale, the world scale, and kind of the first part of your paper where you're contextualizing all of that, the bit, and this is a very unsurprising comment and question for me, what I want to know is, why or where is population in all of that? Because this sets aside whether or not it should be there. That's not relevant to me at the moment, but just empirically, when you look at all of your players, UNESCO and FAO and early Union Conservation of Nature, especially in that 1948, 1949, 1950, and all the elements, soil erosion, desertification, peace and war, land and food, so unsurprisingly, but actually I think unsurprisingly for me, but more importantly, just plainly empirically, there's a population talk all behind that I think drives it all, and that, and a bit surprisingly, given your reference to great acceleration, and also in the pie charts, population gets put outside all of that, whereas originally it's not at all. So why do you think that is?
Well, I would argue from the people I read that the population, actually limiting population, was something they couldn't talk about after the Nazi concentration camps. So they turned it into a science problem to be solved by feeding the world. So they didn't want to reduce the population, they just wanted to make sure they could feed them. That took the heat out of the concentration camp politics, and no one could sort of talk about politics in India, which was just becoming its own nation, because it had, there was clearly so many different levels. Population is such a complicated issue in India, but you can talk to everybody about feeding them, and so they've moved the discourse onto common ground, things that they can do together, and it's suited the Americans, who wanted to do big agriculture, and basically so much of this is promoting Monsanto. It's unbelievable. I mean, Rachel Carson told us this in 1962, but it's really happening back there in the 40s. And the other thing I think to remember is that in the 1940s, being an industrial chemist was a moral, strong thing in the world. And I've been trying to write about that. My father was an industrial chemist and then changed to being a priest, which I think gives you a lot of ideas about how, this is why he was retraining in England when I was 2. Had to do it before he turned 30. But he worked for Monsanto, and he could he'd been practical, but he believed he was doing things for the world, the right thing for the world. He felt very guilty because he was too young to serve in the war. He was 16 when the war finished, so he sort of felt like he was not a proper man, and so he went into industrial chemistry. And I think that psychology is really fascinating, and I would like to think more about. I mean, that's just a personal take, but it's thinking about what you do know from personal things sometimes gives you a way into, where's population. I think they couldn't talk about population. It was an elephant in the room. It was the one they couldn't talk about because there'd been a genocide. You can't talk about population in that moment.
So I think it's so interesting about something like industrial chemistry and artificial production of fertilizers and so forth as having this moral and world-minded dimension is so interesting and unexpected, and I think it's really so interesting. But I actually think the chronology there about when population can and can't be spoken about isn't correct, Libby, because in fact the late 40s and the 50s, and by the 60s, you've got, it's the reverse. That's the high moment of entirely explicit, not just conversation, but India and Nehru explicitly putting population questions into the 5-year plan for India. And by the time you get to the 60s, the White House is putting population and food explicitly on its agenda as foreign policy. And so it's the opposite. It's not that it couldn't be talked about, it's the high moment of talk. And that's where I see the gap with.
I think that was a high moment of talk in the 50s and 60s, but it wasn't in the 40s. I think when the first discovery of the concentration camps, between 45 and 47, it was very hard to talk about those things. And America was sort of kind of holding an uneasy truce between and Russia and Britain and the groups that the alliance were holding together. Once the Russians fell out, then the discourse became more American and more about promoting feeding the world. But the feeding the world stuff came from before the war too. So it was a thing to pick up from before the war. So we had 1929 was the Grow More Wheat year. And that was basically what caused the dust bowls of the 30s. It was a bad idea to grow more wheat. It crashed the prices, and the lands were ruined, and that brought in soil conservation. So there was a sort of a big global program that looked like a good idea at the time that came out of the end of the 20s, and then changed things around. And a lot of the things that were unresolved in the 30s were picked up by the post-war reconstruction moment, so that they're thinking like the 30s in the 40s sometimes. And I think I agree with you that by the time India is really independent, not the period leading up to 1947, but the period in the 60s, the whole discourse is different, and India is a player. But when the British are leaving India, and then there's a sort of I think there's a bit of Anglo silence going on. It's about the Anglos, not about the Indians.
Thanks, Libby. I think I kind of want to pick up again on the kind of, your ideas about conservation in the 1950s. So as you know, this idea of conservation that surfaces in the 1950s has a different character to the kind of activist conservation that develops in the 1970s. Do you think that's common around the world, or is that an Australian phenomenon that kind of takes place? Where did this conservation moment go between the 50s and the 70s?
Well, I think that I think it was common around the world, and I know, for example, that in Sweden, the revelation of the Little Desert happened exactly the same time in Sweden, with the bushwalkers clubs getting together to save areas for birds near Stockholm, and Jenny Beckman has written about that. And so I know that there's a lot of correspondence, but I think the big thinking about conservation, that's sort of I'm thinking about the planetary and the global and the world-mindedness, which isn't quite the same as either of the others. I think that there was a radical effort to get national parks in America, but it was done by the Conservatives, and they persuaded the Congress to fund the international meeting. I mean, it's incredible how much the America's Best idea became. This is something America can give the world. We're being generous to the world. It was a sort of generous offer, and also something that America did was bigger than other places and so on. And Canada, which was even bigger, went along with it, and Australia, which was also big, went along with it, because there was a sort of discourse that suited those new nations, and the old Europe was clearly in tatters and couldn't even grow food, so that all those places were working on feeding the people whose lives have been shattered by the actual actions of war. I may have missed you asked about activism. Well, I think that the activism is there. I mean, Crosby Morrison is being an activist. There's no question about that. And he's absolutely a conservative. He's a member of the Melbourne Club. He hangs out, he was, the night before he died, he went to something that the Queen was at the hall, so he was right in the conservative groove. And so it was activism, but it wasn't tying yourself to trees. It was a different sort of, and of course the union movement was also, the green bands were one of the early things, and they also worked with conservatives. It was women in expensive suburbs in Sydney working with the unions that made the green bands work. I mean, there was a lot of non-partisan concern for the environment, and I think once we had the environment constructed as land management, and not as something out there and wild, that changed the way the people did activism as well. But it didn't necessarily make it partisan at that stage.
Thank you. Sandro?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Libby. Yeah, I suppose I asked this question as a native of West Heidelberg, and, you know, my parents still live there. And so, you know, for me, the Olympic Village has a very, you know, it has a non-1956 meaning. It has a, well, I suppose, post-1980s meaning. And I suppose to give people the right idea, or, you know, to a bit of the background, is that that part of West Heidelberg, postcode 3081, is one of the most deprived areas of Melbourne. Since the 1980s. It's one, you know, very entrenched inequality, very entrenched disadvantage. And it also, I mean, to give, you know, its physical location is right there on the Darebin Creek, which is another one of the interesting, you know, one of Melbourne's major kind of little waterways with, you know, beautiful. Well, when I was growing up, one didn't venture down there for risk of, I don't know, encountering pollution, such things, and it's been cleaned up since. Which is really just a long entree to, you know, really pushing back and asking more about the urban and the suburban. You know, Olympics are really, I suppose one associates Olympics with cities, with their urban events. And of course, more recent ones often blighted with, you know, white elephants, these kinds of things. And I'm just thinking about the bloody Winter Olympics, you know, all the fake snow then getting disrupted with the real snow. You know, so they've got their own ecological impacts. But, you know, Melbourne in 1956 is a city of 1.5 million. West Heidelberg back then is not quite, it is at the edges of Melbourne, but it's not quite, you know, the periphery it used, you know, Heidelberg originally was. Yeah, so I'm just intrigued, someone like Morrison or other people fighting for land protection, soil conservation, etc. I mean, how explicit, I've never quite understood how explicit they were in linking the urban with the regional or rural. And I think that's, you know, if we're talking planetary, you know, the urban, I think, continues to be underexplored amongst us environmental historians. And even though there's increasingly a lot of wonderful work there. So I'd be intrigued about your thoughts there, Libby.
Yeah, well, I think I am too. I'm working exactly in that space. I think Graham Davison's stuff on the family car, and how it changed the relationship between the city and the country is very interesting. So that if you live in a suburb that doesn't have public transport, you have to buy a car. And West Heidelberg was one of those ones that didn't have, there was nothing there. It was the Heidelberg and the Darebin Creek, in fact, were the sites of 19th century art. And my mother went there because she was interested in the golden age of art. And she was an artist, and she used to go down to the Darebin Creek, and I've got lots and lots and lots of pictures of the Darebin Creek looking lovely because the Melbourne water had cleaned the area up, I think. But so she moved there in 1984. So she was it was McLeod, and where she was a bit different from West Heidelberg, but it's not far away. And this, in terms of legacies of the Olympics, well, the most important legacy of the Olympics was the public housing offered by the Olympic Village. It was built, it was already organised for the athletes, and there were lots of immigrants coming in, so they got the public housing that was left over from the Olympics without much renovation or effort. That was what was issued to them because it was available to be issued, and it wasn't part of the privatised rest of Melbourne, if I can put it that way. So the cities, typically the cities have had much less public land than the country, except for right near the centre of the city where Robert Hoddle had the beautiful big parks like Royal Park and so on, and had put them aside early and made them sacred and like the parks of London. So there was a sort of a London planning thing on inner city, and then the suburbs went out on the railway lines, and the bits in between were green spaces, but they weren't developed as either parks or as suburban. They were just nothing. And that's why the Olympic Committee could get hold of West Heidelberg, which was a spare empty spot, and whack a whole lot of houses on there. I mean, when you look at the photos from, it's dead flat. It's not very hard to whack up fairly cheap housing fairly quickly. And it is, that a lot of that housing still survives and is cheap to buy. And there aren't many places in Melbourne that are cheap to buy. So it's now all privatised, of course, but it's not, I think it still might have the highest level of public housing of any suburb of Melbourne. I'm not sure. I can't remember. There's some statistic like that. So yeah, the Olympic Village is a legacy, and it's an interesting legacy. I mean, I don't think it's a white elephant. I actually think it's a good. How do you get public housing happening in a big city? It's really hard, and Olympics is a way to do it. So maybe, yeah, the La Trobe University, of course, is very near there, and that's changed the culture of the area a lot. I know in my mother's street there were a lot of people who worked at La Trobe. But yeah, it was an affordable house for her. She didn't have much money either. It was a small house in a good. It was the worst house in a slightly better street.
Oh, you go, Libby, please.
No, I hope I've answered Sandro's question.
I think we might wrap it up there. Thanks again, Libby, for the great scaling out from the urban to the planetary, even in that last question. So I think another round of applause, please. And thank you all for coming and for the discussion. Our next talk, we hope you'll join us for our next talk, which is next week on the 1st of March, when we'll be hearing from the University of Cambridge's Professor Duncan Kelly, who's presenting Wartime for the Planet, a seminar about the language of global war, the Anthropocene and the First World War. Please note too, if you're interested in coming to that seminar, the change in time, Professor Kelly's seminar is scheduled for 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks again, Libby, for your expertise and your talk this morning.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. We'll see you all hopefully in the next couple of seminars.